Subscribe to take your place in this universe full of science fiction and horror stories, and go after the unknown. Because some truths are hidden in the dark. The sky burned, not with fire, but with the cold, merciless gleam of Zarkan warships blotting out the stars. Their hulls, black as the abyss, drank in the light, vast and silent against the endless void, casting long, spectral shadows over Earth's trembling cities. Below, the people watched, some through windows, some through screens, some with their own eyes from rooftops and open streets, standing as tiny, fragile things beneath an overwhelming force. War had always been a distant thing, a relic of history, something confined to books and films, fought on battlefields that most had never set foot on. It had been something waged through screens, through financial markets, through the slow, grinding inevitability of political maneuvering. Conflicts had existed, yes, but they had been surgical, controlled, executed from a distance with drones and targeted strikes, with cyber warfare and economic sanctions. War had become something that happened elsewhere, something civilized nations avoided. But this was not a war of nations. This was a war of annihilation. The ultimatum had been clear: surrender and serve, or resist and perish. Humanity had chosen neither. They had chosen to defy. The first strike came with the precision of a surgeon's blade. There was no warning, no declaration of hostilities beyond the cold, mechanical voice that had spoken from every hacked transmission, every hijacked satellite feed. The words had barely finished echoing before the orbital defense systems, Earth's supposed first and strongest line of protection, were gone, reduced to nothing but silent, tumbling debris. The attack had been so fast, so absolute, that by the time military leaders even attempted a coordinated response, half the world's most advanced installations had already been reduced to craters of molten slag. Communications faltered, systems collapsed under invisible pressure as entire networks were seized, rerouted, or wiped clean. The Zarkan did not fight like men. They fought like a force of nature, as inevitable as gravity and just as indifferent. And yet, something in their calculations had gone terribly wrong. They had expected submission. They had expected chaos, leaders scrambling to negotiate, entire populations paralyzed by terror, fleeing or surrendering en masse. It had worked before, on other worlds, with other species. Their empire had been built upon the certainty that when faced with overwhelming force, resistance crumbled. But they had never conquered humans before. The first sign that their conquest would not proceed as planned came in the form of silence. Not the silence of surrender, not the terrified hush of a species awaiting its fate, but a deeper, more deliberate stillness. New York went dark, its sprawling skyline vanishing into the abyss, swallowed by its own defiance. But when the emergency grids came online, something had changed. Data flows had been redirected. Encrypted channels, once under Zarkan control, had been restructured, repurposed, locked behind firewalls that were human-made, but suddenly impenetrable. In Tokyo, a fleet of drones, meant to pacify, to surveil, to keep the population contained, veered off course. One by one, they turned, their programming overwritten, their targeting systems recalibrated. They attacked their own carriers first, then moved on to Zarkan ground forces, striking with the very precision their creators had once prized. In Sao Paulo, the underground became a lifeline, tunnels meant for mass transit repurposed into arteries of resistance. Through them, weapons moved unseen. People vanished and reappeared where they were least expected. The city's neon lights flickered, blinked in odd, unnatural sequences, until one realized they were not random at all. They were messages, instructions, codes guiding unseen movements, orchestrating an invisible war. Humanity had not been caught off guard. The Zarkan had mistaken a refusal to fight for weakness. Humanity had not refused because it was afraid. It had refused because it had seen war before, had survived it, had learned to adapt, to endure. And now, faced with annihilation, it did what it did best. It evolved. The first Zarkan patrol that entered a city expecting an easy occupation, found something else entirely. The buildings stood intact, the streets eerily empty, abandoned cars left frozen at intersections, storefronts still displaying their wares as if the world had simply paused. It was unnatural, unsettling. The soldiers moved with the arrogance of conquerors, their armor gleaming, their weapons humming softly in the dark. They scanned their surroundings, reptilian eyes flickering over the empty streets. They did not notice the motionless figures nestled in the rubble, did not hear the whispered commands traveling through hidden frequencies, did not recognize the streetlights blinking in calculated, rhythmic sequences. Not until the first explosion. It came not from the buildings, not from the obvious places where one might expect an ambush, but from below, from beneath their very feet, where the sewers had become more than waste channels, where the infrastructure of the city itself had turned against them. The ground ruptured, fire and shrapnel swallowing the first wave before they could even cry out. Then came the gunfire, but not from a standing army. From shadows. From rooftops. From windows that had once belonged to offices and apartments, now turned into sniper nests. The Zarkin, for all their might, for all their technological superiority, had never fought like this. They were built for large-scale battles, for dominance through overwhelming power. They had never faced an enemy that did not fight in open fields or across planetary surfaces that had already surrendered. They had never fought against ghosts. The occupation that should have taken days stretched into weeks. Zarkin forces found themselves not liberators of a newly conquered world, but prey, hunted through the ruins of a species that refused to die. For the first time, the Zarkin Empire faltered, not because they lacked firepower, not because they had underestimated humanity's weapons, but because they had underestimated humanity itself. They had not invaded a species that would simply bow to fate. They had woken something far more dangerous. They had woken humanity. The city was silent, but not dead. Beneath the rubble, behind shattered glass facades, within the husks of what had once been symbols of human civilization, something stirred. Smoke curled into the air from distant fires, their embers glowing against the night sky. High above, Zarkin warships hung like vast, unfeeling sentinels, their angular shadows slicing through the broken streets below. The occupation should have been over by now. The planet should have been pacified. And yet, the war had only just begun. Sergeant Elias Vance crouched behind a half-collapsed wall, the jagged edge of broken concrete pressing into his back. He barely noticed. His focus was on the scene ahead, a Zarkin patrol advancing through the ruins, their formation tight, their weapons scanning the darkness. Their movements were methodical, precise, the product of creatures who had spent their entire existence in conquest. But tonight, something had changed. They were moving slower, hesitating. Elias watched them through the scope of his rifle, noting the way their heads turned in small, almost imperceptible increments, their senses reaching for something unseen. They had learned to fear the silence. It had taken weeks, but the mighty Zarkin Empire, conquerors of a dozen star systems, had finally begun to understand that Earth was not like the others. He waited, every second stretched, the air thick with unspoken violence. His earpiece crackled softly. A single breath, the signal from Cala Ruiz that she was in position. Somewhere to his left, Daniel Grayson would be setting the last of the charges. The trap was set. Now, all they needed was for the enemy to take one step further. The lead Zarkin did. A flash of movement. The sound of metal slicing through the air. The first soldier fell before his companions even registered the attack. A jagged length of reinforced wire wrapped around his throat, pulled taut from the darkness. No gunfire. No explosion. Just a soft gurgle as alien fingers clawed helplessly at the steel cutting into its flesh. By the time the body hit the ground, the others were reacting too late. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions. A sniper shot punched through the visor of one, a perfectly placed bullet shattering the narrow slit where armor met exposed sensory flesh. Another Zarkin stumbled as an unseen figure emerged from the ruins, blade flashing once before disappearing back into the shadows. It was over in seconds. The last soldier, breathing heavily through damaged filters, barely had time to register his squad's destruction before Elias stepped forward and fired once, cleanly, into the base of its skull. The alien collapsed without a sound. Kala emerged from her position, eyes sharp, scanning the ruins for any signs of reinforcements. "They're adapting," she murmured, nudging one of the fallen bodies with her boot. "Slower, more careful, but still predictable. They won't be for long," Elias said. He knew better than to underestimate them. The Zarkin were not mindless. If they had been, Earth would already be lost. A soft chime in his earpiece. "Daniel, charges are set. We're on the clock, Vance." Elias nodded, motioning for Kala to move. They picked their way through the ruins, slipping between collapsed structures and broken alleyways, ghosts moving through a dead city. It had once been a financial district, a hub of human ambition, towering glass buildings stretching toward the sky. Now, those same structures lay shattered, their skeletal remains jutting into the night like fractured ribs. And beneath them, hidden from the eyes of the Zarkin fleet above, lay the target, an underground transmission hub, one of the last remaining pieces of Earth's old digital infrastructure. The Zarkin had taken it, of course. They had turned it into one of their own relay stations, feeding data from orbit, coordinating troop movements, tracking resistance activity. If humanity wanted to survive, if they wanted to do more than just run and hide, they needed to take it back. They reached the edge of the structure, pausing in the shadows. From here, Elias could see the glow of alien interface panels, their symbols flickering like cold, distant stars. A pair of guards stood watch, weapons at the ready, their posture alert. They knew something was coming. They just didn't know from where. Kala adjusted the sight on her rifle. "Take the left." Elias nodded. "On my mark." The shots came in unison, silent, precise. The guards crumpled before they could so much as raise an alarm. Elias moved first, slipping into the structure, rifle raised, Kala close behind. The air inside was sterile, unnervingly cold. The hum of alien machinery pulsed beneath the surface, a rhythmic thrum that sent vibrations through his boots. The Zarkin did not waste space on aesthetics. Their technology was all function, no ornamentation. Hard angles, efficient designs, walls that pulsed faintly with unfamiliar energy sources. Daniel was already inside, crouched near the main control terminal, fingers moving quickly across a stolen interface device. His expression was focused, illuminated by the dim glow of alien script scrolling rapidly across the screen. "Give me a minute," he muttered. Systems running redundancies. Whatever they're transmitting, they're paranoid about losing it. "Can you shut it down?" Elias asked. Daniel didn't answer immediately. His fingers flew over the controls, working faster now, his brow furrowed. Then a curse. "No, but I can reroute it." Elias frowned. "Explain." Daniel didn't look up. "If I shut it down, they'll know. Instant lockdown, reinforcements within minutes. But if I mimic the output, keep the signal running while replacing the data with false information, they won't realize they've been compromised," Kala finished. Daniel grinned, a sharp, wolfish thing. "Exactly." Elias considered it. The risk was high. If the Zarkin discovered the deception too soon, retaliation would be swift. But if they could pull it off, they wouldn't just blind the enemy, they would feed them misinformation, turn their own systems against them. "Do it," Elias said. Daniel nodded, hands flying over the controls. The alien script shifted, distorted, replaced by human-coded instructions. Somewhere, in some distant Zarkin command center, officers would be reading false troop movements, receiving fabricated reports, believing that their occupation was proceeding exactly as planned. A soft beep. Daniel exhaled. "Done." Elias pressed his earpiece. "All teams extract." Then the alarms blared. A voice, cold and unfamiliar, echoed through the structure, speaking in the guttural tones of the Zarkin language. A response. They had been detected. Not in time to stop them, but enough to send reinforcements. Elias turned to Daniel. "How long until they realize?" Daniel hesitated. "Minutes. Maybe less. Then we run." They moved, swift and silent, back into the ruins. The knights swallowed them once more, but behind them, the battle had already shifted. The Zarkin, so sure of their dominion, were now chasing phantoms, their own systems feeding them lies. For the first time since the war began, humanity had seized not just a victory, but an advantage. And the Zarkin had no idea. The city had become a graveyard of light and shadow. What once stood as a monument to civilization now lay in ruin, its towering structures broken, its streets buried beneath ash and debris. The scent of war clung to the air, a mixture of burnt concrete, melted steel, and something sharper, something unnatural. Elias Vance moved through the wreckage with quiet precision, his boots pressing into dust that had once been monuments, homes, lives. Above, Zarkin warships hovered, their blackened hulls drinking in the dim glow of a fractured moon. Their presence was a weight, a looming specter against the sky, a reminder that even now, this war was not theirs to win, at least not yet. A sudden rustling to his left. He stilled, pulse steady, breath held. The sound was small, deliberate, not the erratic scuttling of a scavenger or the dull creak of settling ruins. Someone, or something, was there. Elias shifted behind the remnants of a broken stairwell, rifle raised, eyes scanning the darkness. Then, a flash of movement. A boy, thin, ghost-like, slipping between the skeletal remains of an abandoned car. Elias exhaled slowly, lowering his weapon by a fraction. Not a threat. Not yet. The boy turned, meeting his gaze. Even through the grime smeared across his face, his expression was sharp, too sharp for someone his age. He raised his hand, fingers moving in a quick countdown. 3, 2, 1. Elias barely had time to react before the first shot split the air. Plasma fire sizzled past, striking the stone beside his head, sending up a spray of molten debris. He ducked, pivoting, returning fire without hesitation. His stolen Zarkin rifle kicked hard against his shoulder, the shot slamming into his attacker's chest. The creature staggered, but did not fall. Damn, he had aimed center mass. A mistake. The armor absorbed the blast, dispersing the energy across its plated form. The Zarkin lifted its weapon, adjusting, recalculating. Elias adjusted faster. The second shot came from behind him, human-made. A single, deafening crack. The bullet found the exposed joint beneath the alien's jaw, punching through soft flesh and brittle bone. The Zarkin crumpled. Elias turned sharply, expecting to see Kala or Daniel. Instead, the boy still stood by the wreckage of the car, an old revolver trembling in his grip. The barrel smoked faintly, his knuckles white against the handle. Elias barely had a moment to register this before the next wave hit. More Zarkin, moving like wraiths through the debris, weapons glowing, forming a calculated perimeter. Elias swore, diving for cover as a fresh volley of fire erupted around him. His earpiece crackled. Elias moved. Kala's voice. Close. He didn't hesitate. He ran, vaulting over a shattered barricade, feet pounding against the broken pavement. Another shot tore past, close enough that the heat seared the edge of his jacket. The boy was gone, fled or dead. Elias didn't know. Didn't have time to find out. He slid into the remains of an old department store, breath sharp, body tense. Kala and Daniel were already inside, crouched low behind the shattered remnants of a checkout counter. Glass crunched beneath his boots as he took position beside them. Kala didn't look up from where she was checking the magazine of her rifle. You're late. Got held up. Daniel exhaled, adjusting the strap of his gear. The longer we stay here, the worse this gets. Elias nodded. They had no base, no permanent refuge. The resistance had become something fluid, something shifting. They never stayed anywhere long enough to be predictable. That had kept them alive until now. Kala pressed a hand to her earpiece. Echo team, report. Silence. Then a voice. Faint. Uneven. Trouble. Elias stiffened. What kind of trouble? The answer didn't come from Echo team. A new voice cut in. Something guttural, layered with static. a sound that sent ice splintering through Elias' veins. The translator, embedded in their comms, struggled to process the alien speech, twisting it into something comprehensible yet wrong. "You think you are clever," the voice said. "You think we do not see you." Daniel went rigid. Shit! His fingers flew to his earpiece, ripping it free, crushing it beneath his boot. Kala did the same. Elias followed a second later, his mind racing. "They tapped our comms," Kala said, voice tight. No, this was worse than that. The Resistance had been feeding the Zarkan false information for weeks, leading them into dead ends, forcing them to chase shadows. But this wasn't a response to misinformation. This was something else. They hadn't been tracking soldiers. They had been tracking civilians. Elias thought of the boy, of his silent countdown, of the way the Zarkan had arrived so quickly after. He had thought the child was warning him. But what if he hadn't been? What if he had been marking him? His stomach turned. The Zarkan had never understood human warfare. They had expected armies, structure, control. They had been caught off guard by a resistance that fought like ghosts, striking and vanishing before they could retaliate. But now they had adapted. They had found the cracks in humanity's defenses, and they were using them. Kala's expression was grim. "We have to move." Daniel hesitated. "Where?" Elias exhaled, glancing at the map spread across the shattered countertop. The city was a labyrinth of destruction, but there were still places untouched, places the Zarkan controlled outright, places no resistance fighter would willingly walk into. He tapped a sector marked deep in enemy territory. "Here." Kala frowned. "That's suicide." "Maybe," Elias said. "Or maybe it's the last place they'll expect us to be." Because now, the war had changed. And this time, humanity wasn't just reacting. It was setting the trap. Rain fell in thin, icy sheets, streaking through the jagged remains of Paris. It clung to the rubble, running in dark rivulets through the cracks of shattered pavement, pooling in the footprints of those who had passed through before. In the distance, the hollow wail of the wind moved through skeletal buildings, but beneath it, the city held its breath. The war had not paused. It never did. But tonight, the silence before the storm felt heavier. Elias Vance adjusted the hood of his stolen Zarkan cloak, the dark material slick against his fingers. The fabric was dense, designed to blend into the night, to distort the outline of the body beneath. They had scavenged them from fallen enemies, piecing together disguises from whatever they could find. Tonight, it would have to be enough. Kala and Daniel moved ahead, their silhouettes low against the ruins, their movements precise, careful. They had spent years adapting to the art of disappearing, but this was different. They weren't running now. They were walking into the fire. Elias scanned the street. Zarkan patrols moved through the wreckage in slow, deliberate circuits, their helmets reflecting the faint glow of their interface panels. They were on high alert. They had learned. No longer moving in rigid formations, no longer assuming that control meant safety. The resistance had taught them to be afraid. It wouldn't be enough. They had set a trap, but so had the enemy. The Zarkan had stopped hunting soldiers. They had turned their attention elsewhere, to the streets, to the underground networks, to the civilians who had nowhere left to hide. Elias had seen the signs. Abandoned safe houses raided with no survivors, encrypted signals disrupted before they could reach their destinations, the quiet, creeping fear in the eyes of the few who still dared to fight. They had been baited before. Not this time. The plan was simple. Infiltrate the occupied zone. Plant the charge. Collapse the relay tower that fed the Zarkan false intelligence. It would send their command structure into chaos, turning their own surveillance against them. The risk was absolute. If they were caught, there would be no escape. Kala's voice was barely above a breath. "We're running out of time." Elias nodded. They moved as one, slipping between the skeletal remains of buildings, keeping to the shadows where the rain blurred the outlines of their bodies. Every step carried weight, every breath measured. One mistake, one misstep, and the mission was over before it began. A patrol passed within feet of them. Elias stilled, barely breathing, watching as the soldiers moved, their voices low and clipped, speaking in the guttural tones of their language. He had spent months learning their words, understanding their patterns, their structures. The Zarkan thought in precision. They did not account for chaos. That was their weakness. The team reached the outer barricade, a hastily constructed wall of metal and debris, reinforced with Zarkan technology. The checkpoint beyond was heavily guarded, soldiers stationed at every entrance, drones sweeping overhead in slow, calculated rotations. Daniel exhaled through his teeth. No way through. Elias' gaze shifted to the left, to the narrow alley where the wreckage of an old tram lay half-buried beneath the rubble. The tunnels beneath it led into the city's deeper levels. Long abandoned, collapsed in some places, but not all. Calla followed his line of sight. "You're insane." "Probably." Daniel adjusted his pack. Better than walking into a firing squad. They moved quickly, slipping through the ruins as the rain covered their tracks. The tunnel entrance yawned open before them, a gaping wound in the earth, its edges lined with rust and broken stone. The descent was steep, the air thick with the scent of damp metal and decay. Their footsteps echoed, swallowed by the dark. The deeper they went, the more the city above faded. Here, in the remnants of the old world, time felt suspended. Graffiti still marked the walls, relics of a life that had once existed, words scrawled in a dozen different languages, some messages of defiance, others of surrender. Elias ran his fingers over a faded inscription, barely legible beneath layers of grime. "Nous sommes toujours là." We are still here. The tunnels twisted ahead, leading them beneath the heart of the occupied zone. They moved in silence, senses sharp, listening for the telltale sounds of approaching danger. Then they heard it. Not footsteps, not voices. A steady, mechanical hum. Elias froze, eyes flicking to Daniel, who had already pulled out the small scanning device he had rigged from salvage parts. The screen flickered, distorted, before stabilizing. A single red dot pulsed ahead. Not a patrol. Something worse. "Drone," Daniel murmured. "A Zarkan hunter class. Not the clunky surveillance models that patrolled the streets. This was a seeker built for precision, designed to track movement in confined spaces. If it detected them, there would be no fight, only execution." Calla gestured sharply. "Back. Now." They reversed course, moving fast but quiet, retracing their steps through the maze of tunnels. The hum grew louder, a vibration that pressed against their skulls, setting nerves on edge. The seeker was close. Too close. Then another sound. From ahead. Footsteps. Human. Elias barely had time to register the figure before he saw the gun. A rifle, old but well-maintained, held by a man whose face was gaunt, eyes sharp with fear and defiance. A survivor, but not alone. Behind him, others emerged from the shadows. Women, men, a girl no older than 16, clutching a knife too large for her hands. Their clothes were tattered, their faces hollow with hunger, but their expressions held something deeper than desperation. Recognition. They knew who Elias was. Before he could speak, the girl lifted her chin. "You led them here." Her voice was steady, accusing. Elias understood instantly. The seeker wasn't hunting at random. It was following them, tracking their movements. And now, it had found something more than just resistance fighters. It had found the people they were supposed to be protecting. A new pulse of sound reverberated through the tunnel. Closer. Calla's jaw tightened. "We need to move. Now." Elias looked at the survivors, saw the choices written in their faces. Fight or run. Stay or die. His mission had been simple. It wasn't anymore. He turned to the girl. "Do you know another way out?" Her hesitation was brief. Then a sharp nod. Elias exhaled. "Then let's go." Because the war had changed again, and survival was no longer enough. The tunnel walls pulsed with the rhythmic hum of the seeker drone, its vibrations crawling up Elias' spine like an unshakable presence. The air smelled of damp metal and old decay, the scent of a world that had been buried long before the war began. Water dripped from overhead pipes, echoing in the confined space, masking the soft shuffle of hurried footsteps. Elias moved fast, keeping low, eyes locked on the girl leading them through the labyrinth. She was small, sharp-boned, her dark hair cut unevenly, her movements quick but deliberate. The others, malnourished men and women, their clothes ragged, their eyes wary, followed in silence. He hadn't planned for this. The mission had been simple. Get in, plant the charge, escape unnoticed. But war did not allow for clean execution. The moment that girl had spoken, accusing him of leading death to their doorstep, his priorities had shifted. Now, they weren't just trying to escape. They were trying to keep these people alive. A distant metallic clatter broke the silence. The Seeker was searching. Not hunting yet, not quite, but close. Calla whispered beside him. How much farther? The girl didn't stop moving. A minute. Daniel adjusted the strap of his pack. We don't have a minute. The tunnel forked ahead, splitting into 3 paths. One collapsed, one submerged in stagnant water, and one disappearing into darkness. The girl hesitated, and Elias caught the faintest shift in her posture, the tightening of her fingers. She was recalculating. No, he said, voice firm. Don't think. Move. She swallowed whatever doubt had flickered across her face and darted into the rightmost tunnel. The group followed, deeper into the black. The Seeker's hum grew sharper. It had found a trail. Elias forced himself to breathe evenly. They needed a way out, but rushing blindly would only get them killed. He studied the tunnel walls, searching for anything. A hatch, an exit, a space to disappear. The girl veered left suddenly, leading them into what looked like an abandoned storage section. Rusted supply crates lined the walls, half crushed beneath the weight of time. A single ladder stretched toward an overhead maintenance hatch. She turned to Elias. It leads to the surface, but it's locked. Daniel moved forward without hesitation, pulling a compact torch from his pack. I can cut through. Elias checked their rear. The tunnel was empty. The Seeker wasn't in sight, but its presence was a pressure against his skull, a feeling more than a sound now. It was listening. Work fast, he said. Calla motioned the civilians into the shadows, tucking them out of sight behind the crates. The girl stayed close, her fingers twitching at her side, her weight shifting from foot to foot like she was ready to bolt. Elias crouched beside her. What's your name? She blinked, surprised. Lena. Lena, he repeated, testing the shape of it. You've survived down here for a long time. Her jaw tightened. Because we don't make mistakes. The implication was clear. He had made one by coming here. Elias didn't argue. The people with you, family? No. He nodded once. That was all the answer he needed. Survivors weren't bound by blood anymore. They were bound by circumstance, by the simple, brutal need to keep going. Daniel let out a sharp exhale. Hatch is done. The lock hissed, metal groaning as he pried it open. A gust of cold air rushed down from above. Fresh, but tainted with smoke. The city was still burning. Calla climbed first, emerging onto the surface. Elias signaled for the civilians to follow, helping them one by one. Lena hesitated, eyes flicking toward the tunnel entrance, her fingers curling into fists. Elias placed a hand on her shoulder. Go! She swallowed, then climbed. The moment she disappeared, the hum changed. Not a search anymore. A lock. Elias turned. The Seeker glided into view, its smooth, insect-like body illuminated in the dim tunnel glow. It moved slowly, methodically, scanning the space with its eyeless sensors. It had found them. Daniel cursed. It's seen us. Elias raised his rifle. No, it hasn't. The Seeker tilted slightly, processing. Then, too fast to react, it fired. Elias shoved Daniel aside as the plasma bolt struck, vaporizing the crate behind them in a spray of molten metal. The heat seared against his side, pain slicing through his ribs. He gritted his teeth, firing back, but the Seeker was already moving, its sleek form weaving through the space with unnatural grace. Calla's voice shouted down from above. Move! Elias grabbed Daniel by the collar and shoved him toward the ladder. Go! Daniel didn't argue. He scrambled up, disappearing into the night. The Seeker recalibrated, targeting. Elias didn't give it the chance. He fired 3 rapid shots, one missing, one grazing, one hitting square in the center of its chassis. The energy blast rippled across its surface, barely slowing it down. It lunged. Elias twisted, throwing himself toward the ladder as the Seeker fired again. The shot missed by inches, scorching the rungs as he climbed. Hands grabbed his vest, pulling him up just as the next shot exploded beneath him, sending a shockwave of heat up his spine. Then the hatch slammed shut. Elias lay on his back, chest heaving, the cold air biting against his skin. His side ached where the heat had grazed him, the burn deep but not crippling. Around him, the others stared, eyes wide, breathless. Kala knelt beside him. "You good?" He grunted. "I'm alive." Lena hovered a few steps away, arms wrapped around herself. She looked at him like she wasn't sure what to make of him. Elias pushed himself up, wincing. "That thing won't stop." Daniel was already digging into his pack. "I left a present behind." Elias raised an eyebrow. Daniel smirked. "Should go off in 3, 2? The ground beneath them shuddered. A muffled explosion rippled through the tunnel system, followed by silence. The Seeker was gone. For now. Kala exhaled. That was reckless. Elias rolled his shoulder, testing the wound. That was necessary. Lena took a step forward, her voice quiet but firm. "What now?" Elias looked toward the horizon. The city stretched before them, broken but standing. Fires burned in the distance, casting jagged shadows against the ruins. The relay tower still loomed, their original target still waiting. But now everything had changed. He met Lena's gaze. "Now, we do what we came here to do, because survival wasn't enough. Not anymore." The wind carried the scent of fire and rust, a bitter reminder of the world they were trying to reclaim. The city stretched before them, a broken monument to what had been, its skeletal remains jutting against the horizon like jagged teeth. Smoke curled from distant ruins, drifting beneath the heavy clouds, casting everything in a dim, copper haze. Paris was dying, but was not yet dead. Neither were they. Elias Vance crouched beside the others, eyes locked on the relay tower in the distance. It loomed over the shattered streets, a grotesque fusion of human architecture and Zarkan machinery, pulsing with an eerie, violet glow. This was their target, the heart of the enemy's surveillance network, the thread binding their forces together. If they destroyed it, the Zarkan would be blind, vulnerable. It would turn the tide of the war. If they failed, there would be no second chance. Lena knelt beside him, scanning the perimeter. She had shed the uncertainty that once clung to her like a second skin. Now, her face was set with quiet resolve. She was young, but she had survived this long. That made her dangerous in a way Elias understood. "They've reinforced the entrance," she murmured. "More guards than before." Kala studied the patrols moving in steady formation. "They know we're coming." "They think they know," Elias corrected. "That's different." Daniel exhaled sharply. "We're outnumbered." Elias watched the patterns, the way the soldiers moved, the gaps between their rotations. The Zarkan operated on precision, efficiency, but predictability was a weakness. And humans? Humans thrived in chaos. "We don't need to fight them all," Elias said. "We just need to make them think we are." Lena tilted her head. "Distraction. More than that." Elias turned to Daniel. "How much of that charge do you have left?" Daniel patted his satchel. "Enough to piss them off." "That'll do." Kala arched an eyebrow. "You sure about this?" Elias smirked. "No." She shook her head, but didn't argue. They moved quickly, splitting into position. Kala and Daniel took the east perimeter, slipping between the ruins, setting the charges where the foundation was weakest. Lena stayed with Elias, navigating the western side, keeping low, keeping silent. The rain had started again, light but steady, muting their footsteps, masking their movements. The first explosion was small, just enough to shake the ground, to make the guards hesitate. The second sent debris skittering across the street, forcing them into tighter formations. Then came the third. The Zarkan responded as expected, shifting from defense to aggression, redirecting their forces toward the disturbance, which left the entrance unguarded. Elias didn't wait. Move. They ran. Through the smoke, through the chaos, slipping past the confusion before it cleared. Inside, the tower was colder than the outside air, humming with an unnatural pulse, its walls lined with alien technology fused into human steel. The invasion had not just been a war. It had been a slow, deliberate infection, spreading through the bones of the world. Daniel pulled up the schematics on his stolen interface, his expression grim. We overload the core, we level this whole sector. Kala glanced at Elias. You planning on walking away from this? Elias didn't answer. Lena's voice was steady. We'll find a way out. He believed her. Or maybe he just wanted to. They worked fast, planting the final explosives, setting the detonation sequence. The countdown flickered to life. 3 minutes. The first alarm blared. The Zarkin had caught up. Footsteps thundered through the halls. Voices sharp, weapons charging. No escape routes left. Elias looked at Lena. You still got fight in you? She raised her stolen rifle. Always. Kala smirked. I like her. The first soldier came through the doorway. Elias fired first. The battle was fast, brutal. The corridors became a choke point, forcing the Zarkin into tight spaces where their numbers meant nothing. Elias moved like a blade through their ranks, sharp, relentless. Kala fought beside him, precise and efficient, while Lena struck with the raw determination of someone who refused to die. Daniel shouted over the gunfire. We have to go. Now. The timer hit 30 seconds. No more time. They ran. Through the corridors, up the emergency stairwell, feet pounding against metal. The walls vibrated, the structure groaning under the pressure of its own failing core. They burst onto the rooftop just as the final alarm screamed through the city. The explosion swallowed the tower. It bloomed like a dying star, collapsing in on itself, tearing through the Zarkin systems in a cascade of fire and electricity. The shockwave hit them seconds later, sending them sprawling, the air ripped from their lungs. When Elias opened his eyes, the sky above was filled with falling embers. The warships that had hovered so confidently above the city now drifted, uncertain, their connection severed, their control shattered. Kala groaned, pushing herself up. Tell me that worked. Elias grinned, breathless. That worked. Lena sat up, watching as the remaining Zarkin forces below scrambled, disoriented, leaderless. Daniel exhaled, shaking his head. I can't believe we pulled that off. Kala smirked. You should have more faith. Elias stood, scanning the ruins below. For the first time in months, the city felt different. Lighter. Alive. Lena looked at him. So what now? Elias exhaled. The war wasn't over. But for the first time, it felt like they had a chance. He smiled. Now we win.